Frid shalom vänner. Vår värld är i fullständigt kaos. Och nyss kom det en uppgift om en dubbel jordbävning på 7,0 i Japan med tsunamivarningar. Det Jesus säger ska föregå hans tillkommelse sker i varenda punkt. Varenda punkt. Nu är det dags att vakna vänner och blåsa i basunen, ty Herrens dag är nära. Och det första tecknet som jag sa i predikan i söndags är villfarelse. Och Herren varnar jättestarkt om infiltration i våra församlingar. Vi klarar inte av att stå emot mörkret. Det är ganska tydligt när man har stora konferenser där talarna står och talar ett direkt New Age-budskap med en annan Jesus Kristus, en antikristus som betyder istället för Kristus. Och människor sitter och klappar i händerna och tar emot detta elände utan att pröva skriften. Jag är rädd för, vänner, att många kommer att följa med i det här tåget nu. Och det verkar ju som om det drar mot Rom. Manipulation på alla håll. Slutligen då så kommer det ett klipp här med väderläget. Och det är ju helt otroligt vad som händer nu. Sen har James Caddis här ett klipp också. Där han tar upp då vad som händer runt Israel. Och ett nytt Babylon som står upp också. Vi ska höra honom då tala om det här tillsammans med en gäst i studion. Gud välsigna er. Håll era lampor brinnande. Jesus kommer. Nu är det allvar, vänner. Amen.
From the Yemeni Houthis. Now, I say it's unprecedented because the way that the attack was actually launched, undoubtedly we are talking about Iranian drones. And make no mistake, these drones had AI capability because there's no way that these drones could have done what they did with the use of GPS, especially with the way that Israel has mastered rerouting GPS attacks. But one of the things that's interesting was of the 5 or 6 drones that were launched from the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, one of them made it to Tel Aviv, which means it had to have crossed over the Red Sea. It had to have gone through a path that would have landed it somewhere above Egypt, going further north, maybe over the Suez. We don't even know. And in reality, it would have had to cross over a portion of the Mediterranean into Tel Aviv. There were no warnings. It was just a simple motor sound, and then there was an explosion. And then, of course, Israel's response was unique. It was very strong. It was unprecedented in the sense that we are talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 or 16 F-35s, probably another 10 F-15s, and a 2.5 hour flight from their location into the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, specifically Yemen, actually bombing the big port that is in that area that produces $3 million of trade every single day. Only to have to do this, you would have to have the cooperation of many of the people in that region. You'd have to have cooperation from Saudi Arabia. You would even have to have cooperation from Russia and many of the countries that align that what you would call the eastern coast of Africa, which of course would amount to be the western coast of the Red Sea. So that ends up happening. And then of course things begin to escalate a little bit more because Hezbollah responds by choosing to launch some rockets into the north, specifically the area of the Golan Heights, very, very close to the Syrian border. And of course, we lost the lives of 12 or 13 precious Druze children, which of course has created a whole other political issue, especially with respect to the way the Druze continue to carry themselves with the loyalties that they have for the nations that they are in. And then after that begins to take place, then Israel goes back and assassinates the second in command of Hezbollah. This is under Nasrallah, which of course shook up a lot of people in Beirut. And then on top of that, you have Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas, who is their president. Literally, he is the highest ranking actual political operative of Hamas, who's killed in Iran while he is going to pay his congratulations and respects to the new president of Iran, who happens to replace the former president, who was very likely killed in a helicopter crash. This stuff, look, you cannot make this stuff up, and things are beginning to escalate. Things are getting crazier. What's your thought on all of this?
Well, I guess my thought on it is just to put it in a big picture framework. Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, 2,600 years ago, predicted that Israel would be rebirthed as a nation, would become the center of worldwide controversy. And one of the principal players against Israel in the last days would be Iran. So what did you just describe? You just described that whole scenario. Israel has been reborn. She's the center of worldwide controversy. And of course, with the assassination and the flying of the red flags over the mosques in Tehran, they're seeking revenge. And so I guess what I'm seeing is a potential Gog-Magog scenario. At bare minimum, what I'm seeing is massive stage setting taking place, where the Lord seems to be moving heaven and earth, into its proper position for the final drama that we see personified and predicted in Ezekiel 38 and 39.
Yeah, and you are not wrong about this. And what even makes it more interesting is to see the dynamic that is happening in Iraq, specifically with some of the changes that are going on to the south of Iraq in Kuwait. There's the shakeup in the royal family there, as actually one of the members of the royal family professes Christ now. That creates a very, very interesting opportunity with what's happening in the north with the Kurds. That begins to change everything with respect to the approach that they are taking with the reconstruction or the rebuilding of this new city that in essence they're calling Babylon. That also changes things with what's happening in the Persian Gulf. You have India that's taking a notable interest in some of the changes that are taking place over there, while Iran is being held at bay by Russia, and Russia, who's playing both sides of the fence, holding fast with a position with Israel that happens to be somewhat friendly, and at the same time, having a very loud voice with respect to what they call Israeli aggression. This thing is getting more and more interesting by the moment. And then you have Erdogan to the north. This is even a more interesting thing in Turkey, who loses his mind over what Israel just did, probably because it scared the heck out of him. And then he is incited to say, we are positioned in a way where we could attack Israel at any time. And he wanted everybody to know that. And then while doing that at the same time, he beats up Mahmoud Abbas in the same event, speaking in the same moment, because Mahmoud Abbas, who is of the Palestinian Authority, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, offended him, like literally offended him, because he refused to show up at the event that Erdogan was at to come and to commemorate a very specific time in Turkey, and was also a fundraiser. The funny thing about this is an overwhelming majority of the people that are in Judea and Samaria, which is what a lot of people will call the West Bank, which is the sort of the political oversight of Mahmoud Abbas, doesn't even like Mahmoud Abbas. They would rather have Hamas in there. And so to think about the kind of back and forth politically that's going on, it is setting everything up perfectly. And by the way, all of this on the heels of Benjamin Netanyahu showing up to the United States of America and calling for a NATO-type alliance to maintain security in the region amongst Middle Eastern countries, which many Middle Eastern countries, including Saudi Arabia, seem to like the idea. Can it sound more like Ezekiel 38?
Yeah, just the players you mentioned there. You mentioned Russia, you mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Iran. To my mind, those are the big three that Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about. And, if you just go back in time, you see how, unrealistic the whole Gog-Magog scenario was. Russia was a Christian Orthodox nation prior to the Communist Revolution of 1917. and wasn't going to invade anybody, let alone Israel, because she didn't even exist yet. Persia or Iran pre 1979 was an ally of Israel and an ally of the West before the Shah was toppled and replaced with the Ayatollah in 1979. And Turkey used to be a place where Israelis took their vacations.
Yeah.
And so, you just go back in time and you see how crazy Ezekiel's prophecy seemed. But we're now living in the general time period, James, where history has caught up with the scenario that Ezekiel 38 and 39 predicts. I mean, you see all three of those nations hostile to Israel. I mean, my goodness, mid-April, it was Iran that launched, 300 projectiles from from Iran into the land of Israel. You see Russia, Iran, and Turkey not only hostile to Israel, but cooperating with each other, as you just articulated. So I don't know what more God has to do to get our attention, but we're clearly moving into a time period where Ezekiel 38 and 39 is imminent. It looks extremely credible from where I sit.
And this is the thing that just blows my mind. I want everybody to compute this because you mentioned it, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning. What happened in April with Iran is the largest scale missile attack that has ever taken place in world history against Israel, from Iran against Israel. And the thing that is astounding about this is the growing and irrelevant United States of America basically told Israel, you better not do anything. And then instead of Israel doing what they probably should have done, and that is destroy every single one of Iran's nuclear sites, what they end up doing is specifically targeting an S-300 battery system that is literally in the heart of Iran with the permission of Russia, because of the implications that would have been had with the understanding that these battery systems are being operated by Russians. What in the world are we looking at? This is crazy.
Yeah, it's almost like we're saying, Israel will protect you, if you're attacked, but don't once you move into a framework where you're trying to prevent a future attack, we're not going to support you. That's the Biden administration's, it seems to me, their current policy towards Israel. So we're for Israel to an extent. We'll help in case of an attack against you. But if you acted like a sovereign nation and started to prevent future attacks, then we're not with you. And I think that's a real change in United States American foreign policy. And that disturbs me a great deal. When we've got our throat on Israel, we're supplying Israel's enemies with weaponry. I don't think that looks good related to Genesis 12, verse 3, where God is very clear that he'll bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. I fear that our country, the United States of America, is rapidly moving to the wrong side of the ledger. And we are about to the point where God is going to start, if he hasn't already, cursing our country if we don't have a dramatic change back to normalcy in terms of international relations and foreign policy.
Well, and the hypocrisy that is created by the specific position that's being had by the State Department and the handlers of the United States of America alone is something that is just absolutely astounding. Let me give you some perspective on this, okay? For well over 40 years, actually, let's just say well over 30 years to be safe, we have had this second in command guy to Hezbollah on our hit list to want to destroy. As a matter of fact, we have had a $5 million bounty on his head, okay? Israel manages to kill him, and what do? We condemn Israel for doing it. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't even make sense to me. it puzzles me. I'm at a loss for words when I see this. And by the way, we all know this. We all know that President Biden is by far the most lame duck president we have ever had in American history. His handlers continue to tell him what to do. He gets a card that tells him where to walk, when he can use the restroom. There's a video of him walking into an airplane the other day that they had no idea what the airplane was. Like, he just walked in, for a few minutes, everybody freaks out. They try to go find him. He walks out. He's literally an empty shell. He has he reminds me of Nebuchadnezzar when God pretty much cut the tree down. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, like literally cuckoo. And while all of this is going on, you have Kamala Harris, who continues on with her Israeli rhetoric, saying the nonsense that she's saying, the speech that she came out and gave that was supposed to sound presidential for 7 minutes after she met with Netanyahu was absolutely atrocious. But it signaled to the rest of the Middle Eastern world, we're weak. The United States of America is not going to get involved. We're not going to do anything. So have at it. Have a field day. Attack our interests. Attack Israeli interests. Go ahead. Bolster up Iran. It doesn't even matter if we continue to honor agreements like the JCPOA, because the sunset clause on those agreements are over with anyway. Let's continue to build up the nuclear arsenal, and we won't do anything about it because we're too weak to do anything about it. Or maybe we might have the strength, but we're too scared to. That's what the rest of the world is seeing right now. And you're right, because one of the things that I can gather from looking at Ezekiel 38 is that we're not going to see any superpowers that are of any consequence, because nobody is going to stop what Russia and the conglomerate of nations do. And on top of that, when they don't stop them, the only people that will be objecting will object, but they will not use any military force to stop it. And the only person that will stop it will be God Almighty. So this is such an interesting picture to be drawn here.
Yeah, I mean, in the good old days, we used to study prophecy and say, well, certainly the United States of America, a faithful ally of Israel, would do something to stop the Gog-Magog invasion, yet the United States is not mentioned in those chapters, Ezekiel 38 and 39. So people used to ask, well, what happened to the United States? Well, what's interesting is nobody asks that anymore.
That's right.
I mean, now the whole situation looks very credible in terms of the United States, doing absolutely nothing. I mean, you mentioned the anti-Semitism of the Biden administration and Kamala Harris, the fact that Netanyahu, comes to the United States recently and is not even greeted, at the airport by either Harris or Biden. The fact that Harris, even though it's her constitutional responsibility to show up at Netanyahu's speech there in the House of Representatives, was a no-show, and they put some Democrat in there who is not even up for re-election. So it's almost like they're more intimidated by Michigan's electoral votes, than they are, treating an ally correctly in the midst of a war. And so, suddenly the United States doing nothing as this invasion occurs, as Ezekiel predicted 2,600 years ago, suddenly that whole situation, makes perfect sense, whereas it didn't make any sense 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, this is so unbelievably remarkable. And one of the other things that fascinate me is the idea that when you read through Ezekiel 38, there is this implication that we can gather that it's going to be a peaceful time for Israel and actually for the region before this attack takes place. I mean, unfenced cities, unwalled cities, how in the world can that be? And as a matter of fact, it's interesting because when Saudi Arabia objects to the attack by Russia, the question is, what in the world got in your mind? We got a sweet deal going on here. What's taking place? And then, of course, there's the discussion with the hook and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is if we know that there's a peaceful condition that has to happen before this attack takes place, it would make sense that the United States of America becomes inconsequential, because what it does is it leaves it up to the leaders of that region to create some kind of alliance in order to produce a relationship that has some level of normalization, not even necessarily a treaty. Even if it's an economic normalization type of agreement, it's more than enough to create the kind of peace that is actually being projected in the book of Ezekiel. And it would also explain why nobody can fend off Russia, because nobody has positioned themselves in order to do it. You don't have fences, you don't have walls. Of course it's not going to happen. So all of this to me is very interesting, and I definitely agree with you when I see the fact that there's a lot of stage setting going on here, because that's exactly what's going on. I have a feeling that Ezekiel 38 is going to take place after the rapture. And the only reason why I believe that is because in Ezekiel 39, God says immediately, I'm dealing with you right now, Israel, which gives me the implication that perhaps this is the dispensation. God is dealing with Israel, which gives me the indicator that we are past the church age here. But with that said, you would have to almost see what we're seeing right now in order for these nations to be forced into this need to create a peaceful condition, because they themselves are going to implode if they don't do that. It just makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right, because prophecies are never fulfilled in a vacuum. And any prophecy of the Bible you want to study, even the first coming prophecies, the stage was set way, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years
Oh,
in
yeah.
some cases in advance. And as humanity kind of drifted towards the time period when that prophecy would be fulfilled, suddenly the scenario started to make more sense. I think that's what we're seeing right now. I think this is one of the great tools that the Holy Spirit is using to grab the attention of the world. I mean, we're literally living in a time period of prophetic stage setting. You know, as we said before, Israel is in the land. She's the center of worldwide controversy. And the very nations that God said would be hostile to Israel are all in place. And as you articulated earlier, they're all in alliance with each other. And I don't anticipate this scenario getting more murky as we get closer to the fulfillment of these things. It's coming into fruition with greater and greater clarity, any way you slice this.
Okay, so I would be amiss to not ask you this question, because in my mind, at least to me, you're the subject matter expert in this. Okay. So amongst our group, amongst our people who teach Bible prophecy, you're the guy that I go to when I want to hear about this. Where does the condition in Iraq fall? What do you think is happening right now with respect to this creation of Babylon? Me and you see this very eye to eye in terms of what's happening. This is me. I'm just telling you my thought. I think that I'm beginning to see some stage setting for the creation of Babylon, the way that we see it described to us in the book of Revelation. It would almost seem as though there's so much attention being focused away from this area that it's creating almost the perfect condition for this to be blooming, especially as has been intended for the last several years. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you know, a very good magician, you know, what he's doing with one hand, you have to watch the other hand because that's where the action is. And as much as our focus is on Israel, Iran, all of these things, you can never take your eye off Iraq if we take Bible prophecy literally. And the two of us do.
Yep.
Revelation 17 and 18 predicts that the city of Babylon will be rebirthed and will eventually become a city of worldwide prominence and significance in the end time scenario. And so there are constantly things happening in Babylon that are preparing the way. I mean, the very least of which is oil. You know, if the Antichrist were to take control in Babylon and annex, you know, some of the surrounding nations, he would, in a heartbeat, in an instant, control about 60% of the world's oil supply. Now, that's, of course, is a big deal because we here in the United States aren't drilling the way we used to. We've shut down or put impediments on Anwar and all kinds of things. So whoever controls the world's oil supply controls the direction of the world. And so that, at bare minimum, to me, becomes a reason why the Antichrist is going to be very interested in the city of Babylon in Iraq. We could mention some other things as well. But as much as our interest many times is on Israel, which it should be, I would encourage your listeners and your viewers to keep their eye on Iraq or Babylon, because that's destined to play a major role in the end times.
Yeah, and I'm very, very interested right now because I'm watching something very unique taking place. If you were to look at a map and you were to look at Tehran and just go straight east. Or straight west. You just go west, 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 west until you get to the northern border of Iraq, and you trace it along the top of Turkey into where it borders Syria, and you come down kind of almost diagonally, okay, where you landed in Iraq. You came across in between Baghdad and Damascus. There are some interesting things that are happening right now that I would just call construction staging. That's the only thing I can call it. Like raw material gathering, construction staging that's happening that gives me an indicator that we are going to see this Babylon construction happening a lot sooner than I think. As a matter of fact, what's even more interesting is when you look at this area where there's a lot of this raw material gathering taking place, they're also building pathways. Like, this is not a joke. They're building pathways into the Euphrates to transport everything down because of the land bridge disputes that has existed further south from that exact location, and it avoids the conflict that exists right now between the Kurds and all the things that are happening in the south. This is such an interesting scenario that I'm watching, and I'm telling you, bro, like, it's all happening under the nose of everybody. Nobody's commenting on it. Nobody's talking about the commercial trade agreements that right now Iraq is trying to establish with the help of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia very specifically has it in their mind to want to avoid access through the Persian Gulf by going across and above the northern border of Tehran through that body of water, and actually come across further south back around. It's really interesting to think what they're doing, especially with the interest that they have in the Arabian Sea, which is far below the area of the Persian Gulf. Like, all of this seems like it's all coming together. There's a security interest that Saudi Arabia has made clear has to be established in order for this agreement that they're trying to normalize with Israel to happen because of trade. They're making this all about trade. And a lot of people might not realize this, but India has a huge stake in this because of the fact that many of the things that they're exporting from India could have a substantial effect on what China is actually doing. It could very much affect China's economic status simply because there's a lot of bypassing going on. So this is, all I'm saying is all of this really tells me that, like you said, massive stage setting going on. All I'm doing is just pointing out the obvious. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, in fact, you can go on the internet now and you can look up these trade agreements, that you're talking about, and they're talking about dry land routes and wet kind of routes, canal routes, I guess is the right way to put it.
Yep.
Going right through where? Right through Iraq, very near the city of Babylon. So what is this going to produce? It's going to produce wealth for the city of Babylon in the future, if not the present. And that doesn't subtract from Revelation 17 and 18. That adds to it. And so a lot of people have said, oh, come on, Babylon can never grow to a position of economic power or a port city, in the last days. Well, these trade agreements that you're speaking of and the maps that are drawn state to the contrary, that no, Babylon is going to be economically powerful in the last days, and she is going to be a port city exactly like the Bible predicts.
And here's the thing that's interesting to me. It's already happening. There's conversation happening right now with Iraq and Iran to develop some type of an agreement for a land passageway that, if you can track with me, covers the southern portion of Iran into Iraq along the Persian Gulf, not so that you're not even touching the body of water. And what that does is it allows Iran to continue to remain being who they are, tough and rough, and working with somebody they traditionally haven't had a lot of conflict with. It's kind of interesting because now if I'm somebody that's on the other side of Iran and I want to start setting up a trade agreement with, let's just say, Israel, for example, Iran doesn't have to deal with the idealistic function that would keep them from entertaining this idea, because their trade agreement is with Iraq, and Iraq is brokering the land transport, which is opening up the door for the type of peace and security we're talking about. And if that does happen, Babylon becomes the center point. You have to have a landing spot. You have to have a staging spot. That's what'll happen. Especially if what they do with Kuwait and this little water bridge area from the Persian Gulf happens, then all of a sudden we also have the stage being set for the destruction that we read about in Revelation 18.
Yeah, and I would just encourage your viewers, your listeners, to not look at Babylon as she currently is, but all of these trade proposals that we're speaking of, because these will come into place at some point, and they will make Babylon wealthy, and they will give her that sort of maritime feel, that we see described in Revelation 17 and 18.
Yeah, I think you're right about this, and I also think that when the United States hosted a meeting with the leader of Iran, I think that's what the motive was. I think the motive was to be able to get their foot in edgewise, to be able to manipulate some of this trade money, for lack of a better term, to help stimulate a portion of their economy that's struggling, really suffering right now, especially because of what we've been doing with our waterways. It's very obvious what's happening, and if that's any indicator of how the other nations are going to act, then everybody's going to come bowing at the feet of Babylon. I think that's what's going to happen. I think you're 100% right on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think people can double check me on this, but it's called port. I think the initials are FAW. If you read that, you'll see all these maps, or Google that, I should say. You'll see all these maps and proposals for what they want to produce.
Yeah, and then the movement of globalism is also looking upon Iran or Iraq favorably. It's really interesting, but I'll have to look that up. You said it's FAW?
It's called Grand FAW Port.
Grand FAW Port. Okay, we'll have to look at that.
Yeah, and that's where you'll read about things like Iraq's ambitious, I think it's FAW Port project, inches closer to completion. You'll see all these maps and all of these trade routes, and every time I look at this, I say this is going to make Babylon A, wealthy, and B, a maritime city.
Yeah, you were right about that, and they're already moving in that direction.